In 1925, a man named Maurice Dorel supposedly discovered 12 tablets carved from a mysterious green stone. When he published the translation in 1939, it was revealed that they were written 36,000 years ago by Thoth, a refugee from Atlantis. These tablets spoke of underground chambers beneath the pyramids, an ancient spaceship, and a race of shape-shifting reptilians that fought a war against early humans.
And the emerald tablets.
Emerald tablet.
Emerald tablets of Thoth the Atlantean.
Around 38,000 years ago, around the same time that Thoth claims to have written the emerald tablets.
Dr. Doreal went to Egypt and explored the area where he thought the emerald tablet might be.
The emerald tablets weren't etched by hand. They were vibrationally imprinted, written with sound into crystalline greenstone.
Look at the legend of the emerald tablets.
And there's an emerald tablet, but there's emerald tablets, but is the emerald tablets, are they fake? This is so legit.
So legit, my man.
So this dude was probably an alien.
The Emerald Tablets have been controversial ever since their publication. Some people claim they're the revealed truth of a forgotten past. Others claim that they were just plagiarized from pulp fiction writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. But almost everything you think you know about the tablets is either incomplete or incorrect. Several years ago, I managed to acquire a rare first edition of the Emerald Tablets. And we're going to take a look at it right now and see if we can't figure out the truth. Shape-shifting reptilian aliens are everywhere in modern culture. From the old TV series V, to animated conspiracy shows, to internet memes, the idea that a non-human race is secretly controlling humanity from behind the scenes has become one of the most recognizable conspiracy theories in the world. But where did it actually come from? The reptilian alien first became popular in UFO lore in the late 1980s and early 1990s, connected to stories of underground bases and secret government cover-ups. But then in 1999, David Icke took the idea global, arguing that a bloodline of shape-shifting reptilians had been controlling human civilization for thousands of years. But Icke cited an earlier source, a book called The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, translated by a man named Maurice Dorel. Doreal didn't just write about shape-shifting reptilians here. He returned to them several times over the years in various publications, and that would have an influence on early flying saucer lore. But many people have pointed out that Doreal's shape-shifting serpent race bears a striking resemblance to something published a decade before the Emerald Tablets. A race of shape-shifting serpent men created by pulp writer Robert E. Howard in a story published in Weird Tales magazine in 1929. For those of you who don't know, Robert E. Howard was a writer from Cross Plains, Texas, who's best known as the creator of Conan the Barbarian. But before Conan, Howard created another character, a barbarian named Kull of Atlantis, who first appeared in that 1929 story, The Shadow Kingdom. Kull was an Atlantean warrior who through sheer force of will fought his way to the throne of Volusia, the most powerful empire in the world. But his wasn't a world you'd find in any history book. This was an antediluvian age, a world before the Great Cataclysm, a world of sword and sorcery. Kull was a barbarian on a civilized throne, surrounded by courtiers and advisors he didn't fully trust. And he was right not to trust them. Thanks to his friend Brule, the Spear Slayer, a Pictish warrior, Kull discovers that many of the people in his court, his advisors, his officials, have been killed and secretly replaced by an ancient race of shape-shifting serpent men. They use sorcery to appear human, but underneath they are something else entirely. Their plan is to infiltrate and rule humanity from the shadows. Brule teaches Kull an ancient phrase, words that can only be spoken by human tongues. When the serpent men hear it, their disguise fails and their true nature is revealed. That phrase is Kanama Ka'a Lajarama. With that knowledge, Kull and Brule fight a vicious, bloody battle to reclaim the throne. They win, But the serpent men aren't entirely destroyed. They're driven back into hiding, and there's always the threat that they'll rise again. Howard wrote a whole series of cult stories, though only 3 were published in his lifetime. They're all collected here if you're interested in reading them. This is a collection put out by Del Rey, and it's available at any of your favorite online booksellers. Cull, Exile of Atlantis. He would go on to become far more famous for creating Conan the Barbarian, of course, but it was Cull and his Serpent Men that would leave an unexpected mark on the world beyond pulp fiction. Howard's friends and correspondents, H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, both loved the Serpent Men and incorporated them into their own stories, weaving them into what would become known as the Cthulhu mythos. The Serpent Men were already spreading beyond Howard's stories during his unfortunately short lifetime. Meanwhile, around 1930, a man named Maurice Dorel founded the Brotherhood of the White Temple. We now know his real name was Claude Doggin. Often you'll see it erroneously misspelled as Doggins, but it's actually Doggin, D-O-D-G-I-N. Dorel's organization started in the Midwest, then moved to Los Angeles, and eventually settled in Colorado. Doreal was an occultist and spiritual lecturer who attracted a dedicated following with a philosophy that blended esoteric Christianity, theosophy, Hermetic philosophy, and Eastern mysticism. Over the years, he published dozens of booklets on topics ranging from astral projection to ancient civilizations to the nature of the soul. Doreal claimed a connection to what was known in occult circles as the Great White Lodge, a group of ascended masters believed to be secretly guiding the spiritual evolution of humanity. It was through this connection, he said, that he came to possess one of the most remarkable texts in the history of esoteric literature. According to Doreal, he had gained access to 12 tablets, carved from an unknown green material, written 36,000 years ago by Thoth, a priest-king and refugee from the lost continent of Atlantis. Doreal published his translation in 1939 as The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. According to the tablets, Thoth was not a god, but an immortal priest-king of Atlantis who lived in the city of Kaor on the island of Undal. The Atlanteans of his caste had conquered death itself. They could renew their bodies by passing into a great fire and returning. Atlantis was governed under the guidance of a being called the Dweller, a vast cosmic consciousness inhabiting a physical form whose voice sounded like the rolling of the sea. The Dweller chose Thoth as his messenger and initiated him into the secrets of the great fire at the heart of the earth. But the people of Atlantis turned toward darkness. They made contact with the serpent race, but we'll come back to that. When Atlantis fell, the Dweller pronounced the sentence and the continent sank beneath the waves. Thoth was commanded to gather his followers, the Children of Light, and preserve the records of Atlantis. He boarded what the tablets call the Ship of the Morning, a vessel that could fly through air and space. And as Undal sunk, the ship rose in the sky and traveled east. He landed in the land of Kim, ancient Egypt. And then Thoth built the Great Pyramid, not as a tomb, but as a gateway. At its apex, he placed a crystal that could draw energy from the ether, and beneath it he opened a passage down to the halls of Amenti, a vast subterranean space deep within the earth, where the masters sit on their thrones, their bodies sleeping, while their souls incarnate into humans on the surface to help guide humanity. At the center burns a flaming flower of life that never goes out. The tablets even give directions for finding the entrance. Draw a line from the Sphinx to the apex of the pyramid and follow it down. Lie in the stone sarcophagus after a long fast, and Thoth himself will meet you in the darkness. That's the story millions of people have encountered through podcasts, YouTube, and social media. An immortal Atlantean, a flying ship, anti-gravity, subterranean halls beneath the pyramids, and a race of shape-shifting serpent men hiding among us. Now, let's talk about those serpent men. Tablet 8 is called the Key of Mysteries, and this is where it gets interesting. According to Thoth, in the Age of Atlantis, men who sought power used dark magic to summon beings from what the tablets call the Great Deep, the abyss below. What came up was a race of serpent beings. The masters drove them back, but some remained hidden. And then they infiltrated. Speak I of ancient Atlantis. Speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows. Speak of the coming of the children of shadows. In the form of man move they among us. But only to sight where they are as men. Serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted, but appearing to man as men among men. Crept they into the councils, taking forms that were like unto men. Slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over men. Only by magic could they be discovered. Only by sound could their faces be seen. Sought they from the kingdom of shadows to destroy man and rule in his place. So they crept into the councils, they killed the leaders, they took on their physical forms, and they ruled humanity from the shadows. But the tablets say there was a way to detect them. But know ye the masters were mighty in magic, able to lift the veil from the face of the serpent, able to send him back to his place. Came they to man and taught him the secret, the word that only a man can pronounce. Swift then they lifted the veil from the serpent and cast him forth from place among men. Yet beware, the serpent still liveth in a place that is open at times to the world. Unseen they walk among thee, in places where the rites have been said. Again, as time passes onward, shall they take the semblance of man. So a secret word that only a human can speak, that strips away the disguise and reveals the serpent underneath. If that sounds familiar to you, hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. By 1946, Doreal had moved his brotherhood to a compound near Sedalia, Colorado, and he started publishing a new series of booklets. And these are some of them. We have The Inner Earth, Atlantis and Lemuria, The Mysteries of Mount Shasta, and this one, Mysteries of the Gobi. These are incredibly rare and far too fragile to open here on camera, but I have carefully photographed each one of them once and closed them back up and transcribed the contents. If there's interest in these, I was actually thinking about maybe posting some of them in my Substack. I'll put a link in the description. Mysteries of the Gobi, in particular, takes the serpent race from the Emerald Tablets and expands it into something much more detailed. According to Doreal, the serpent race was the primal race on Earth. They originally inhabited what's now Antarctica when it was still tropical. Their bodies were faintly scaled with heads like a great snake. As human civilizations rose in the Gobi region, the serpent people migrated, some to the Gobi, some to islands that would become Atlantis, others to Lemuria, the lost continent of the Pacific. And just like in the Emerald Tablets, they could hide among us. Doreal described a mastery of hypnotic powers so advanced they could project a mental image of a human face over their serpentine features. Using this glamour, they infiltrated the kingdoms of the Gobi, killed the leaders, and took their places. But the Gobi masters found a way to detect them. Because of the physical structure of their serpent throats, they couldn't pronounce certain human sounds. So the Gobi humans developed a specific word. Now, we heard about this in Emerald Tablets. Here in Mysteries of the Gobi, he actually gives us that word. It's Kinaningin. So it's not exactly Kalama Ka'a Lajarama, but Kinaningin kind of has a similar sound to it. But that was a test. If a suspected leader couldn't say it, they were exposed as a serpent man. The story ends in catastrophe. The Gobi civilization went to war against the serpent race using what Doreal describes as atomic energy. They directed it against the serpent stronghold in Antarctica, and the blast was so powerful it caused the Earth to wobble on its axis. It created a pole shift. The tropical south froze instantly, trapping the serpent people in the ice. Atlantis and Lemuria sank beneath the waves. And, according to Doreal, the serpent race is still down there, waiting under the Antarctic ice. But Doreal's booklets weren't published in a vacuum. In 1945, something had exploded in the world of science fiction that created a massive audience for exactly this kind of material. In 1943, an editor named Ray Palmer at Amazing Stories magazine received a letter from a Pennsylvania welder named Richard Shaver. Shaver claimed that an ancient race had once inhabited the Earth, but fled when the sun's radiation became poisonous. They left behind a vast network of underground caverns filled with advanced technology. And they left behind the Daros, degenerate descendants who use that ancient technology to torment humanity from below. Voices in your head, mysterious accidents, disappearances, all caused by beings living beneath your feet. Now, Palmer recognized a good story when he saw one. He rewrote Shaver's manuscripts into publishable form and printed them. Not quite as fiction, not quite as fact, something kind of ambiguously in between. This is the March 1945 issue of Amazing Stories, and it contains the first of the Shaver mystery tales, I Remember Lemuria. The response to this was unlike anything in the history of pulp publishing. Thousands of readers wrote in, claiming their own experiences with the Daros. They reported voices, strange encounters, evidence of underground civilizations. Palmer's circulation skyrocketed. Amazing Stories became the best-selling science fiction magazine in America. Now, the Daros weren't reptilian, but the structure is similar. A pre-human race, living underground, using advanced technology, secretly manipulating humanity from the shadows. So, sound familiar? The Shaver mystery was a sensation, and Doreal saw an opportunity. One of Palmer's regular contributors, a Fortean researcher named Vincent Gaddis, who would become famous about 20 years later for coining the term Bermuda Triangle. That's probably another video. Vincent Gaddis encouraged Amazing Stories readers to seek out Doreal's booklets. And then Doreal himself wrote directly to Amazing Stories, claiming that he had also had personally encountered the Daros and that they were very real. And, of course, he encouraged readers to order his booklets. Doreal's serpent race mythology was now circulating among hundreds of thousands of readers who were already primed to believe in underground civilizations secretly controlling humanity. The Shaver mystery gave Doreal a mass audience he could never have achieved on his own. Then, in the fall of 1946, while Doreal was publishing his booklets and writing into Amazing, another man named W.C. Hefferlin started sending in articles to Amazing Stories. One of them described a circular wing aircraft he claimed had been built and tested in San Francisco in the 1920s. A donut-shaped craft capable of speeds over 1,000 miles an hour. When other readers challenged his engineering expertise, Hefferlin responded that he couldn't share the real science because it came from a place called Rainbow City. Palmer then told his readers that Hefferlin claimed Rainbow City was a secret advanced civilization, what we would today probably call crypto-terrestrials or a breakaway civilization. Nobody thought much of it until June of 1947, when Kenneth Arnold famously saw his flying saucers near Mount Rainier, ushering in the beginning of the flying saucer craze. Hefferlin immediately wrote back to Amazing Stories, pointing readers to his circle-winged aircraft article from the year before, saying, "I told you so." He and his wife Gladys then started circulating manuscripts among a number of the Shaver mystery enthusiasts and also a number of prominent occult groups on the West Coast, especially like Meade Lane's Borderland Sciences Research Association in San Diego. They claimed that the flying saucers were coming from Rainbow City, which was located under the ice in Antarctica. So we're getting secret UFO bases in Antarctica right at the beginning of the flying saucer craze in the summer of 1947. Palmer even responded to this, making reference to Admiral Byrd and Operation High Jump while it was still ongoing, something that would become a mainstay of UFO lore in the coming decades. The Hefferlands took Doreal's mythology and ran with it. The serpent race, frozen under the Antarctic ice in Mysteries of the Gobi, now became serpent men preserved in glass tubes in suspended animation beneath Rainbow City. According to the Hefferlands, both humanity and the serpent race were fully extraterrestrial, ancient space travelers locked in a war spanning galaxies and millions of years until they had ended up on Earth tens of thousands of years ago. And the Hefferlands claimed the flying saucers everyone was seeing weren't alien spacecraft at all. They were circle-winged planes sent out from Rainbow City in Antarctica. Their manuscripts circled through the same communities that had been following the Shaver mystery and the Borderland Sciences Network. And then, in 1951, a self-styled Buddhist Lama named Robert Dickoff published a book called Agartha, from his combination bookshop and lamasery in New York City. Despite presenting himself as the spokesperson of a hidden network of Buddhist priests, his material came straight from the Hefferland manuscripts and Doreal's Mysteries of the Gobi. He took the Hefferland framework, the Martian origin, Rainbow City, the Ancient Three, and elaborated on it. His serpent people, though, were Venetians from Venus, who had infiltrated Atlantis by reincarnating as human black magicians. They provoked an atomic war, just like in Mysteries of the Gobi, that sank both Atlantis and Lemuria. And they were still very much active, represented, according to Dickoff, in the newly created United Nations Security Council. So the mythology was growing. Each retelling added new layers while the core remained the same. An ancient serpent race living underground, infiltrating human civilization and manipulating us from the shadows. By the early 1950s, Doreal was back with a new booklet, Flying Saucers, An Occult Viewpoint. You'll often see online that this was published in 1948. In actuality, it was probably published around 1953 or 1954. But this is where it all comes together. Doreal now had 3 types of flying saucers: interplanetary craft from guardian beings, interdimensional craft from parallel worlds, and an ancient disk ship technology recovered from under the Antarctic ice. But the real story was about the serpent people. According to Doreal, Soviet scientists had discovered ancient cities under the Siberian ice and found thousands of bodies in suspended animation. They managed to revive over 700 serpent people, and these serpent beings did exactly what they had always done. They used their hypnotic glamour to replace the Soviet leadership. Stalin's inner circle, according to Doreal, had been infiltrated and replaced by shape-shifting reptilians. So the serpent men of Atlantis were now a Cold War threat. The ancient conspiracy had gone communist. And if any of that sounds like it was borrowed from the Hefferland manuscripts or Dickoff's book, the suspended animation, the Antarctic cities, ancient technology, serpent men replacing current world leaders, well, it was. Doreal, Dickoff, and the Hefferlands were plagiarizing each other, each building on the other's additions. The mythology was feeding on itself, growing more elaborate with each retelling. And at every stage, the serpent people were right at the center of it. Now, by 1961, the ideas that had been circulating through Palmer's Amazing Stories and Meade Lane's occult newsletter Round Robin had crossed the Atlantic. That year, Brinsley Lepore Trench, a member of the House of Lords and the editor of Flying Saucer Review, one of the most influential UFO publications in the world, published The Sky People. In it, he claimed that humans were created by extraterrestrials called the Elohim, right? anticipating Zechariah Sitchin and the original Anunnaki by about 15 years. Mars was the original Garden of Eden before humans came to Earth. An ancient serpent race had interbred with humanity. There's hidden underground civilizations, giants and titans walk the Earth. And again, if any of that sounds like the Shaver Mystery or the Heflin manuscripts, it should. Lepore Trench's wife was Millen Cook, who had made her debut as a writer in Weird Tales in 1936, and then spent the 1940s writing for both Palmer at Amazing Stories and for Mead Lane for his Round Robin newsletter under various pseudonyms and pen names, all during the height of the Shaver Mystery. And she was an uncredited contributor to the Sky People. So now the serpent race had traveled from pulp fiction magazines to occult pamphlets to the British House of Lords. A decade later, after Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods made ancient astronaut theory a publishing sensation, starting in the late 60s and really going into the 1970s, the Sky People and Trench's other books were reprinted in matching paperback editions with the same bold three-dimensional serif font, the same mass-market format, sitting on the same bookstore shelves. Anyone browsing the Ancient Astronaut section in the 1970s might have picked up the Sky People alongside Chariots of the Gods or The 12th Planet by Zechariah Sitchin, which has many of the same ideas. So the serpent race still wasn't a main theme in ufology, but it was right there under the surface, kind of simmering quietly in the Ancient Astronaut paperbacks, waiting for somebody to take it seriously again. But the reptilian trope wasn't just living in obscure booklets and UFO journals. Reptilian beings were becoming a staple of popular culture. The Gorn appeared on Star Trek in 1967. Doctor Who introduced the Silurians in 1970, an ancient reptilian civilization that lived on Earth before humanity went underground and occasionally resurfaced to reclaim their world. Land of the Lost gave us the Sleestaks, degenerate reptilians lurking in underground caverns, remnants of a once advanced civilization. And in 1983, V brought it all home. Reptilian aliens wearing perfect human disguises infiltrating the highest levels of government. That's the Shadow Kingdom on primetime television. And let me tell you, I was a kid at the time. I remember that. Everybody watched it. It was a huge TV event. And then, at the same time, Robert E. Howard's actual Serpent Men were coming back. Marvel Comics had acquired the rights to Conan the Barbarian and Howard's other characters and was publishing Cull Comics with the original Serpent Men back in print. The same creative ecosystem produced He-Man's Snake Men, led by King Hiss, who literally peels off his human skin to reveal the serpent underneath. And there was G.I. Joe's Cobra, a serpent-themed secret organization bent on world domination. And then, in 1982, the Conan the Barbarian film with Arnold Schwarzenegger put Thulsa Doom on screen, played by James Earl Jones, transforming into a giant snake in front of millions of moviegoers. So by the late 1980s, an entire generation, including me, had grown up with shape-shifting serpent villains in their cartoons, their comics, and their movies. When someone suggested it was all real, the idea didn't sound all that strange. It sounded familiar. But the serpent race didn't just survive in reprinted paperbacks and British UFO journals. Through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, a small community of dedicated researchers kept the tradition alive through self-published fanzines and booklets. Thomas Allen Levesque was a UFO enthusiast who had become friends with Richard Shaver himself. He and his wife, Mary Jane, published a fanzine called Hollow Hassle that covered the Inner Earth, the Shaver Mystery, and the serpent race tradition. Bill Hamilton, who would become a prominent UFO researcher later on, especially in the 1990s, published articles on a similar topic. He was part of the same circle. He was publishing often in other journals like the New Atlantean Journal, articles about the Rainbow City and the serpent races. And interestingly, on the editorial board of the New Atlantean Journal, you have figures like Vincent Gaddis and Brinsley Lepore Trench. So again, it's continuing that same tradition that we've been looking at coming out of the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Another person who is a member of this community was Bruce Walton. In 1983, he self-published a book called A Guide to the Inner Earth. And essentially it was a comprehensive annotated bibliography of everyone who had ever written about the Hollow Earth and subterranean civilizations. Doreal is in there, Dickoff, the Heffernan manuscripts, the Shaver mystery, Brinsley Lepore Trench, all of it cataloged, cross-referenced, and of course the serpent race was a part of it. So this was a small world, a handful of dedicated people keeping alive a tradition that stretched back through the Hefferlins and Dickoff and Doreal to the pages of amazing stories. They knew the serpent race material intimately, they'd been writing about it for years, and they're about to collide with something new. In the early 1980s, a physicist named Paul Benowitz became convinced that he was intercepting electronic communications from an underground facility near Dulce, New Mexico, where the U.S. government was working alongside alien beings. What Benowitz didn't know was that Air Force counterintelligence officer Richard Doty was deliberately feeding him disinformation, encouraging his beliefs as part of a campaign to discredit him and protect classified programs at nearby Kirtland Air Force Base. So just as an aside, if you want the full story on Benowitz and Doty, I highly recommend both the book and the documentary Mirage Men. It's a fascinating and disturbing story that deserves its own deep dive. But the Dulce underground base story began spreading through the UFO community. In early versions, the aliens were grays. And in fact, Benowitz may have been one of the first people to coin the term grays in reference to the familiar aliens that we all know. But when this material reached the Hollow Earth and Shaver mystery community, people like Levesque and Walton and Hamilton, it landed in fertile soil. These were people who already knew about an ancient race living underground. They already had a name for it, the serpent race, the Reptilians. Now, around 1987, documents began circulating attributed to a man named Thomas Castello, supposedly a former security officer at the Dulce facility. Castello described multiple underground levels, joint human-alien operations, and in the lower levels, reptilian beings, not just grays, an ancient reptilian race that had been living beneath the earth long before the government arrived. And he also talks about conflicts and even fights between government security forces or special forces and reptilian aliens. When the Castello papers started circulating, the Hollow Earth and Shaver community recognized the material immediately. Here was a government whistleblower describing exactly what they'd been researching for decades. Of course, they amplified it. Bill Hamilton published the material in Alien Magic in 1989 and Cosmic Top Secret in 1991. Thomas Allen Levesque, under the name Tal, wrote articles about it under that name and also under a pseudonym that he used, Jason Bishop. Bruce Walton, who was now going by the name Branton, began compiling the Castello papers alongside other Dulce material and began distributing them on the early internet and Usenet groups in the early 1990s. And in fact, I actually remember that. I was in my early 20s, in the early days of the internet, and this stuff was everywhere in UFO communities, in those early days in the mid-1990s. And a lot of other people from that era may remember Branton and the Dulce papers. They were compiled as the Dulce Book and later the Dulce Wars. But a lot of people probably don't know that he was actually began as Bruce Walton, who was a Shaver mystery and Hollow Earth guy back in the 80s. Now, within a few years, David Icke would be citing Branton and some of these other sources and this material directly in his books. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. In 2019, researcher Adam Gorightly published a book called Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks. And in it, he reported that Tal Levesque, shortly before his death, confessed that he had fabricated the Thomas Castello material. Testallo never existed. There was no security officer at Dulce. The testimony that became the foundation of the reptilian underground base mythology was a fiction experiment created by a man who had spent decades immersed in the Shaver mystery and the serpent people tradition, a man who had been friends with Richard Shaver himself. Now, just to be clear, all we have is Golightly's account of this confession. We can't independently verify it. But if it's true, and Golightly is a very serious researcher and he knows his stuff, then the document that introduced reptilian aliens into the modern UFO narrative was written by a man who got the idea from the same tradition we've been tracing throughout this entire video, a tradition that started with a story in Weird Tales magazine in 1929. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet. In it, Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki, the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, were actually extraterrestrials who had genetically engineered humanity as a slave race. It was enormously influential and popular. He followed it up with a number of sequels. But Sitchin's Anunnaki were humanoid. They looked like us, just bigger and more advanced. They weren't reptilian as you often see them depicted today. At least not yet. In 1989, William Bramley published The Gods of Eden. Drawing heavily on both Zecharia Sitchin and Lepore Trench, he traced a brotherhood of the snake through thousands of years of human history, a secret force manipulating civilization from behind the scenes, from humanity's extraterrestrial origins thousands of years ago to modern-day secret societies. The book was reprinted in paperback in the 1990s, and it was in the metaphysical section of pretty much every major chain bookstore. The Serpent Conspiracy was now accessible to anyone browsing the shelves at Barnes & Noble. In 1994, Dr. Arthur David Horn published a book that fused it all together. He took Sitchin's Anunnaki, the ancient Mesopotamian gods reinterpreted as extraterrestrials, and he made them fully reptilian, which they weren't originally. This is his book, Humanity's Extraterrestrial Origins, and it was published by a small sort of UFO press in the mid-1990s, but it was reprinted and widely circulated, especially in metaphysical bookstores and places like that. And it had Eric von Daniken writing the preface. So now the ancient astronaut tradition and the reptilian tradition had been fully merged. And then David Icke took it global. In 1999, a former BBC sports presenter named David Icke published The Biggest Secret. Drawing on Horn, Bramley, and Sitchin, he argued that a race of shape-shifting reptilian beings had been secretly controlling humanity for thousands of years through royal bloodlines and positions of power. Whatever you think of his conclusions, there's no denying his influence. Icke made the reptilian hypothesis a global phenomenon. If you've encountered the idea of shape-shifting reptilians anywhere, books, podcasts, YouTube, social media, the trail almost certainly leads back to him. A few years later, Icke published Children of the Matrix, and this is where it gets interesting for our story, because in this book, Icke expanded his research. He discovered sources he hadn't used before, sources he believed independently confirmed everything he'd been saying. He cited Dickoff's Agartha. He cited Lepore Trench's Sky People. He cited Sitchin, of course, right? Bramley, Horn. To Icke, these were independent researchers spanning decades, all converging on the same truth. But then he found something he believed was even more significant. Not a modern researcher, not a UFO book, an ancient text, 36,000 years old, written by an immortal Atlantean priest king. He found the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. He quoted from them extensively. The shape-shifting serpent race, the infiltration of human kingdoms, the ancient war. To Icke, this was the confirmation that changed everything. Ancient wisdom written millennia before any of his other sources, describing exactly what he'd been saying all along. But it wasn't really independent confirmation. It was the original source that all of his other sources had come from. So was Maurice Dorel really borrowing from Robert E. Howard and other pulp fiction writers? Or is this all just coincidence? Similar ideas drawn from the same ancient mythological traditions. Howard certainly had an extensive knowledge of ancient history and mythology, as well as knowledge of theosophical traditions. But this connection was actually first identified back in 2003 by two researchers who appeared to have reached the same conclusion independently. Michael Barkun, in his book A Culture of Conspiracy, wrote that the notion of a shape-shifting serpent race, quote, in all likelihood, first came from the imagination of an obscure pulp fiction author, Robert E. Howard, end quote. He traced the specific parallels between the Shadow Kingdom and the Emerald Tablets and noted that Doreal's appearance in Amazing Stories provided grounds for believing he was familiar with pulp fiction. That same year, Daniel Harms, who's a prominent Lovecraft scholar, one of the foremost experts on the Cthulhu mythos, independently noted in his book, The Necronomicon Files, that Doreal's Serpentmen passage matched Howard's Shadow Kingdom in what he called, quote, an amazing number of details, end quote. Harms also identified something else. In the Emerald Tablets, Doreal describes beings he calls the Hounds of the Barrier. They pursue travelers through space and time. They move only through angles. The only protection against them is a circle. In 1929, Frank Belknap Long, another correspondent of Lovecraft's, just like Robert E. Howard, published a story in Weird Tales called The Hounds of Tindalos. In it, beings from beyond space and time pursue a man who's traveled through the past. They can only reach us through angles. The only protection is to eliminate all angles and make the space circular. The Hounds of Tindalos was published in the March 1929 issue of Weird Tales. The Shadow Kingdom was published in the August 1929 issue of the same magazine, 5 months apart. Both stories appear to have left their mark on the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. Now, here's what's interesting. Neither Barkun nor Harms points to a significant Lovecraft influence on the Emerald Tablets, despite the fact today most online skeptical discussions describe them as a Lovecraftian plagiarism. I would argue that there is a Lovecraftian flavor to some of this writing, but I think the direct influence that some researchers credit to Lovecraft specifically is very much overstated. Listen, don't get me wrong, I'm a Lovecraft guy too. I've published on Lovecraft, I've been a guest at Necronomicon, but I can tell you there is a tendency of a lot of Lovecraft scholars to sometimes overemphasize Lovecraft's influence in certain areas where it's probably not warranted, often at the expense of some of his colleagues like Howard or Long or Clark Ashton Smith. And it's kind of understandable because today Lovecraft is a bigger name, and so there's a tendency to be somewhat Lovecraft-centric when looking at a lot of this stuff. But I think it's very much overstated in the case of Emerald Tablets. In any case, to be fair, is there a Lovecraftian influence or Lovecraftian elements in the Emerald Tablets? Probably. I think some of the language about beings existing between spaces and other dimensions echoes some of the language in the Dunwich Horror from 1928, and that would be about the right time when we know Doreal was probably reading Weird Tales. But it's atmospheric. It's seasoning. It's not the main course. The core of the Emerald Tablets that we've been talking about, the shape-shifting serpent race, the infiltration of human civilization, the killing and replacing of leaders, the secret words that only humans can speak, that's not Lovecraft. That's Howard. And the Hounds of the Barrier, that's not Lovecraft either. That's Long. But the overall premise is right. Doreal was borrowing from pulp, horror, and fantasy writers and putting their ideas into a document he presented as ancient revealed wisdom. But it's not Lovecraftian plagiarism, it's a Weird Tales plagiarism. But I want to point out the influence of another important pulp writer on the Emerald Tablets that no one has identified yet. Abraham Merritt. Almost nobody today remembers Abraham Merritt, but in the 1920s and 30s, he was one of the most popular fantasy writers in America. He was a major influence on both Lovecraft and Howard, which means that some of what modern researchers identify as Lovecraftian influence may actually be Merritt instead. In 1918, Merritt published The Moon Pool in All Story Weekly. one of his most popular works, followed by its sequel, Conquest of the Moon Pool, in 1919. This is the original all-story weekly from 1919 with Conquest of the Moon Pool. The story takes place at Non Modal, the real-life ruins on the island of Ponape in the Caroline Islands. Massive basalt structures that to this day no one has fully explained. In Merritt's story, Non Modal is a gateway to a subterranean world. Beneath it lives an entity called the Shining One, also known as the Dweller, a luminous being of immense power existing at a different vibrational frequency. And that's a depiction of the Dweller right there from the story. Its voice is described as being like the rolling of waters, and in the world beneath Non Modal sit 3 ancient silent beings who serve as judges and keepers of the balance. Now, listen to the Emerald Tablets. The Dweller of Unal, a being of pure light, a son of the morning, his voice like the rolling of the sea, seated in judgment, and beneath the pyramid, the lords of the cycles sitting on their thrones in the halls of Amenti. And where does Doreal sit one of his secret cities in his Flying Saucer book years later? Non Modal. He describes a god called Tangoroa living in vibratory sleep beneath the ruins. Merritt published The Moon Pool in 1918, 21 years before the Emerald Tablets. In 1923, Merritt published The Face in the Abyss. It has an ancient serpent civilization in South America, displaced by a catastrophic pole shift. The same structure Doreal uses in Mysteries of the Gobi for his serpent race, frozen at the South Pole. Then, in 1931, he published the sequel, The Snake Mother, in Argosy, with an ancient serpent being of immense power. In 1932, he published Dwellers in the Mirage, which features a cult worshipping a tentacled entity called the Kalkru. In Mysteries of the Gobi, Doreal's serpent race worships the Kraken. I have a feeling that if certain researchers had actually read Mysteries of the Gobi, they would have almost certainly assumed that that was supposed to be Cthulhu. But no, it's Abraham Merritt. Then, in the late 1940s, Doreal's Brotherhood of the White Temple was actually selling bootleg reprints of Abraham Merritt stories as booklets to their followers. So that makes it pretty hard to argue that Doreal wasn't heavily influenced by pulp speculative fiction. So Howard gave Doreal the Serpent Man conspiracy, Long gave him the Hounds of the Barrier, Merritt gave him the Dweller, Non Modal, the Pole Ship Catastrophe, and the Kraken Cult, and Lovecraft gave him some atmospheric languages about beings between dimensions. Doreal wasn't really channeling ancient wisdom, at least with these elements. He was reading weird tales and Argosy and amazing stories, and he took some ideas from them. So where does this leave us? Some of the key elements in the Emerald Tablets, the shape-shifting serpent race, the Hounds of the Barrier, the Dweller, do appear to come from the pulp fiction magazines of the 1920s and 30s. But I want to be clear about something. That's not all that's in the tablets. Doreal was also drawing from real-world esoteric and occult traditions, theosophy, Hermeticism, Egyptian mysticism, and he was cutting and pasting it all together. Not unlike Madame Blavatsky herself, to be honest. The Emerald Tablets are a synthesis of many sources, some ancient and some not. And I think that's why they still resonate with so many people. There is real esoteric philosophy in there alongside the pulp fiction. And who am I to judge what someone gets out of a sacred text? If the Emerald Tablets have been meaningful to you, nothing I've said here changes that. A text can have questionable origins and still contain ideas worth thinking about. And Howard himself wasn't inventing from nothing either. Serpent mythology is ancient and global. The Nagas of Hindu tradition, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the serpent guarding the golden apples of the Hesperides, the serpent that eats the plant of immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient serpent that was the last of its race that survived a cataclysm in the tale of the shipwrecked sailor in Egyptian mythology. Serpent worship was ubiquitous across many cultures. Howard was a voracious reader of mythology and history. He absorbed these traditions and synthesized them into something new, the shape-shifting serpent infiltrator. That concept was his innovation, but the raw materials are ancient. What Doreal did take was Howard's synthesis, blended back together with the same mythological traditions Howard likely drew from, and added elements from Merritt, Long, and the Western esoteric tradition, and presented the whole package as revealed ancient wisdom. It's not entirely ancient. It's not entirely modern. It's a layered text with roots in both. The part that became the reptilian conspiracy theory, the shape-shifting, the infiltration, the secret war against humanity, that trail leads back to Howard. But the Emerald Tablets are bigger than the reptilian theory, and the mythological traditions that Howard and Doreal both drew from are older than either of them. I think the real takeaway is this. Ideas move. They move through mythology, through fiction, through occult teachings, through conspiracy theories, through pop culture. They change shape at every stage, kind of like the serpent men themselves. And tracing that movement, understanding where an idea came from and how it got to where it is today, that's worth doing. Not to destroy anyone's beliefs, but because the journey of an idea is always a story worth telling. If you enjoyed this video, then hit like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you liked, where you thought I was completely out of my mind. Do you think the reptilians are real? Was Robert E. Howard secretly a part of the Serpent Men conspiracy? Let me know in the comments. Tell me what you think. Until next time, take care, everyone.